Hello everybody, thanks for joining me for another video. One of the supporters of this channel and some of the other stuff I've done, Terry Moore, asked me if I could sort of talk about the really bad things that goes on in the world after the one of the recent tragedies in Texas at the church. It was like a massacre, and it's one of the, if you speak to people or read about it or whatever, about like spirituality, God, religion, whatever, those type of things, people will always say they don't believe in God or a higher power because of all the bad things that goes on in the world. And of course that from one perspective it's totally understandable, isn't it? Because you would think that how can such, if there is a higher power and a God, how can that entity allow such atrocities to exist? And it's quite a sort of, from one perspective, it's quite a narrow view of what this higher power and God is. This is the way I see it. There isn't an entity that sits above us, granting some wishes and not granting others, and making sure that doesn't happen and making sure this doesn't happen, and deciding someone's fate and saying, right, that guy's bad, I'm going to do this and this and that to him. Of course, there isn't. And of course, when you really try and understand it or get to a deeper place, you realise such a thing would be impossible if we were to live like we do. The gift, the biggest gift that we've been given as beings is free will. Now, if something were to intervene on the earth and say, right, that's not acceptable, I can't permit that to happen, the suffering of children or the torture of rape of women and children, you would be interfering with our free will. And that would totally destroy the whole foundation of everything, the whole point of why we're here. We're here to make our own choices as individuals and as cultures and as a planet. And I think it's fair to say that we've done a pretty shit job at it so far. From some perspectives, if you wanted to look at the world negatively, you could find a million ways, and you could, if you wanted to, you could say that we're all doomed as a species. There's more than enough evidence for that, isn't there? But you have to think that, well, it couldn't be any other way. How could it be any other way? It couldn't. We've been put on this earth for a reason. The flowering of human consciousness, as Eckhart Tolle says, and that's a good way of putting it. Of course, that's what it is. Everything else is secondary. Our primary purpose is the flowering of human consciousness. We're growing in consciousness. Now, animals, flowers, everything that's on the earth is here for the same reason. I think it was in the Bible that said even every blade of grass will eventually become enlightened. It's no accident that we're here. There isn't, it isn't just a random. You speak to these scientists who say it's just a random meeting of chemicals that created life on the earth, and that's the only reason we're here. It's an accident. Well, that's total bullshit. That's just scientists, when they're caught up too much in the science, because they can't even come close to finding the answers to the biggest questions, which are, what is consciousness and how did we get here? You'll never find, on the level of form, you will never find the answers to those questions. It's impossible, because what we are is beyond the form that we see. We have a very limited view of the world, and for a reason. We're existing within the illusion that is form. And it's a very realistic illusion. It can't be otherwise. So it's, if you look at the suffering and the pain that goes on, it's on, from one perspective, a total tragedy. The things that go on these days, and in Manchester, where I live, only a few months ago there was the bombings in Manchester at the arena. It's something that I wasn't affected with personally, but I was professionally. And it's, you can't even imagine. I've not been through a tragedy like that. To lose someone close to you like that in such a way, I cannot even begin to conceive of the kind of what you must have to go through. The Course in Miracles, which I would recommend to anybody. The opening passage in the book, it's a channeled book. There's a documentary about it on YouTube. I recommend that you watch it. And the first, I believe the first passage in that book was, nothing real can be threatened, nothing unreal exists. Herein lies the peace of God. And that means, not, when you get down to it, what that means is that no matter what happens on the earth, no matter what tragedies beset us, no matter what suffering you go through, anything that was ever real and of value is never taken away. The life force, the life essence, if you will, whatever you want to call it, soul, consciousness, whatever, of anybody, of any living creature on this planet is eternal. There's no doubt about that. It isn't something that you need to prove, and anybody that spends time and devotes himself to the spiritual path and the seeker of truth will understand that, and it comes from a deep place that you know that you are eternal life, and everybody is. Everything that exists in this world is God essence in a way, manifesting as form, everything. And that's, in the Bible, Jesus said, you look under a rock and you will find me there. So there would be people that would listen to this and call me ignorant and say, how dare you, when they've been through terrible tragedies, and that's totally understandable. And of course, who's to say that there's a high probability that if some kind of tragedy to that extent I would go through, I would turn around and say, what a load of old nonsense I was talking. Because I would then shake my fist up to the heavens and demand answers. And you're never gonna get those. I've been through tragedies. I've been through unimaginable suffering. Which is what sort of set me off on what I think is like a spiritual path. I started at the point in life when I was totally just lost without anything. I can't sometimes struggle to understand how I'm still here. I had nothing else to do than pick up a spiritual book that caught my eye in a bookstore when I was walking round. I don't think that was an accident. And reading a few pages of that book, just something just sort of something switched inside. I was like, oh my God, I've been getting it all wrong. And since that was a number of years ago, and since that time, I've been through some really hard times. It never ends. Even you will never be on this earth without challenges. There was one, I can't remember where I read it, but there was a great sort of way of looking at it, a perspective. And when I said that we're here and our consciousness is here to grow, of course that's the case. But and it's the same if you think about a flower, which is, beautiful creation. When a flower grows, it doesn't have a choice in the matter, and it will go through. It grows and when it experiences growth, it may go through what could be considered pain and challenge from the perspective of the flower to sort of flower and burst through the bud and all that. And we have to go through a similar thing, but the difference between us and the flower is that we have free will. So when we are bursting through the bud and hitting pain and suffering, we will stop and say, no, I'm not going through that. I refuse. And that's when suffering sets in. When you refuse to accept the flow of life. Now, in some circumstances, if you look at the picture now of that little lad on the rubble, which is why I picked that, because it's quite, hard hitting. You would, in some circumstances, like accepting the present moment and accepting what has happened, would seem impossible on the level of form. Like, let's say your whole family was wiped out in terrible circumstances. To sort of accept the present moment and say, I surrender to what is, would seem almost impossible. If that were not possible, which it is, but it would be very difficult, only an enlightened master probably could do that, then you have to surrender and accept what is at a secondary level, and that is to surrender to the pain that you are going through. Because ultimately you will have to go through that, and once you get to the other side, your consciousness has grown, and the purpose of what has happened will have been fulfilled, the destiny of what has happened. There is inevitability about everything that happens. It's the tapestry of life. So, what you're never going to figure out why certain things happen. It's never going to happen. You could try. I tried for years to try and figure out why did I have to go through that? Why did such a thing have to happen to me? You're never going to get the answer. And you don't need to. You just need to believe. If you can't know it deeper, you need to believe that everything happens for a greater purpose. There is method in the madness. You've got to think about it. Something as complex as the universe. How could there not be a method, a reason behind it? We're not, we think of ourselves as an isolated fragment in an alien world. When we're part of that. We are the universe. We're not part of it. We're not in it. We are it. We're all connected. Every one of us. Every blade of grass. Every animal. Every flower. Every human. Every alien that's in the cosmos. Every planet. So you never the most important fundamental lesson that is something that is signified within the cross, which sometimes the meaning isn't really fully understood or taught. You look at some people, and this isn't to demean anybody else or anything, it's just the way that the world is. We're not taught the important things. People have these tattoos of the cross, and I asked the odd person, like, what's the meaning of what's that? Well, I'm a Christian. Okay, well, why the cross? Well, it's the symbol of Christianity. Well, what does the cross mean to you? And they haven't really got the answer. And of course, it's the symbol of human suffering and surrender. So Jesus was crucified on the cross, and it's said that he originally first said, sort of, Lord, why, or Father, why have thee forsaken me? As if to say, why? It was the resistance to what is happening, to what he was going through. And that brought around suffering, and then eventually there was the surrender. And he said, forgive them, for they know not what they do. Which is the first moments of acceptance. You surrendered, and that brings about peace. Now, it's sometimes easier said than done, isn't it? Because it also sometimes feels like the most unnatural thing to go through such suffering. And we all do. But there is a difference between pain and suffering. Pain is an inevitable part of human existence. Suffering needs time. So in other words, it needs a mind-created self to suffer, because you will either look into the future or into the past. If you exist entirely within the present moment, there will be pain, but there will be no suffering. And if you totally accept the pain 100%, invariably it will go away. Or not necessarily go away, but it will be transmuted into peace. So if we go back to like the tragedies, let's look at 9/11. The murder of thousands of people. It's some children, women and children, pregnant women. It would seem totally senseless, and of course it would be insane to say on the level of form, on the perspective of humans, that it isn't insane. Of course it is. Murdering people is fucking, it doesn't get, it's totally barbaric. However, from the perspective of the absolute, if you look at it like from the perspective of God, if you will. I don't like using that word very often, because my idea of God is the very life essence that we are, that we all have inside of us. It's life itself. Consciousness that's God. If you look at it from the universe, if you look at it from the perspective of the universe, let's say, like when millions of turtles, thousands of little turtle eggs are born, are created, and out of those thousands of turtles, and I got this from watching the Blue Planet the other day. It's one of my favourite. From that perspective, there's such a small percentage of the turtles survive, and they all get eaten within the first few hours or days. All the little turtles that scamper off into the sea. And only like one or two out of these huge batch of turtles survives into adulthood. Now, from our perspective, that's tragic. There's a little turtle that's been born and it just dies. From the perspective of the absolute, it isn't tragic. It's the game of form. It was birth and death. You cannot have birth without death. From the perspective of the absolute, the human suffering that we entail is equally less tragic. If I was to say that to someone who'd been through a tragedy, I would get punched in the face, and probably rightly so, because you wouldn't say that to somebody in that situation. But that's what is meant when you say nothing unreal exists, nothing real can be threatened, herein lies the peace of God. That's kind of what is meant, really. And what you got to understand, I love reading about spiritual awakenings and what people go through. Before people die, there is an opening into the formless, into the enlightened perspective. And that can happen to anybody before they die. before tragedy besets them. So if you look at those tragedies that have happened, we don't know what those people were going through and what the state of being was before they died. The people, when you see the tragedy on the 9/11, when the people were jumping from the buildings, there is no doubt at all that some of those people will have transcended this dimension and fulfilled the purpose before they died. The flowering of human consciousness happened in such a way that it seems to be almost insane that we have to go through that, but it's the way. It can't be any other way. We have to exist. When we go back to formless essence, everything exists in perfect harmony. Within that dimension, there's no point talking about it too much, but within the dimension, if you want to call it heaven or whatever, within that dimension, there isn't an opportunity for growth because everything is perfect. You are perfect. Everything is. There is no chance of growth within that dimension. That's why this universe was created. Another way of looking at it, I can't recommend enough the Conversations with God series. It can explain this a hell of a lot better than I can. And it's written by Neil Donald Walsh. There is numerous books, but there is book 1, Conversations with God, book 1. I can't recommend that enough. And those try the best to explain that the reason that the kind of world is here is because that God, or consciousness, wants to know itself, and that's why it exists in infinite number of varieties. If you think about just the planet, let's just have a look at planet Earth and all the millions of different life forms that exist on this planet. Just look at the ocean and the millions of life forms, thousands, and if you go from microscopic to largest creatures, the whales, and all of it is God expressing itself and knowing itself, and that's kind of us. That's why we're here. Now, if you look at the massive complexity and the wondrous life forms that just exist on the planet Earth, take that beyond into a cosmic scale. There is, if you try and believe, recently the scientists have discovered that the universe is only like a fraction of the size of what they thought it were. There is an infinite number, virtually infinite number of stars out there. They reckon for every grain of sand on every beach in the world, there is 1 million stars in the cosmos, which is just fucking quite staggering. So, there is an infinite number of ways that God is expressing itself. And kind of the reason for our existence, it's like polarities. Good can't exist without bad. Form can't exist without the formless. Hot can't exist without cold. So, if we were here on this planet and nothing bad were to happen, what would be the point? If everything was good, nothing bad ever happened, from the perspective of where we are now, what would we even be here for? We would be in heaven. So there'd be no opportunity for growth. And when you see, what we do is when we come to this planet, when we exist as humans, we lose our connectedness to the source, to God, to whatever. We're separate. We're separate beings. We're not, but we think we are, and that's the way it's meant to be. So that's why you develop an ego, because you become separate from everybody else, and you want to think you're bigger than everybody. It's all because of fear. So when we lose that, our purpose is to regain it. When we lose our connectedness, and when you find something that you once lost. It is attained at a deeper level, and that is the whole purpose of why we're here. It's the flowering of human consciousness. You know, it's so easy to get lost, and we have such a limited perspective. The universe, think about the universe as like a jigsaw, a massive, the biggest jigsaw that you could ever conceive of. We have, in that jigsaw, from a human's perspective, one piece of that jigsaw with one little part of the pattern in it. Now, if you were to take that little piece and not have the picture of the big jigsaw, you'd look at that little piece and you'd go, "What the hell is what's this? What does that mean? What on earth is all that about?" You wouldn't have a clue what it was. You wouldn't have the slightest inkling of what that grand design is, that the big jigsaw is. Now, if you then took that piece and put it back in the jigsaw and looked at the picture that it was there to make, it would then make sense, and you go, right, I get it. But that's not going to happen from where we are now, because we can't conceive of something so complex with our human minds. It's just not going to happen. It's impossible. We can't attain that with our minds. It's just not going to happen. It's crazy to conceive that would be the case. So have compassion and do not judge, because we do not know why a thing is and why a thing exists and what a purpose is. One of the things that something that the Conversation in God series talks about, and something that I happen to truly believe, is that one of the things that puzzles me is if you look at some people who are so much more advantaged than other people, some people who are born into wealthy families with great health and that, born and end up becoming very attractive people or very intelligent, you're thinking, why has that person got so much more than the child who may be born disfigured and come from a terrible background, terrible as in poor? And you can almost go mad thinking about that and grow very bitter and angry. But what the books say is that soul, that being that's going through that, chose to do that. The teachings in the book say that there is a reason. That individual soul wants to experience that hardship to grow in a certain way and then return back to the source. The Conversations with God series also says, and I don't want to go into this too much, that nobody dies without their consent. Now that's something very difficult to grasp. I'm not going to go into that too much here. But I also think there is some inherent truth in that. But, some people would just say that's ludicrous. How could the child say that he wanted to be taken away? And of course, like I said, it's part of the grand picture and why certain things happen. And, it's the most important lesson in all of this is to accept. It's non-acceptance that causes suffering. I'm going to leave it there, guys, because I'm running at about 30 minutes. I hope that anybody has got something out of this, and it's trying to explain the impossible. So it's not easy, but yeah. So I'll leave it there, guys, and I really thank you for listening. Please, if you've listened to this and enjoyed it, you enjoy my take on things, just please let me know. And if you've got any ideas for any other videos, anything else you'd like me to talk about, because I'm going to try and grow this channel. if I can. So I really appreciate it, and I'll speak to you soon.